So you can output things to the screen, which is pretty exciting by itself. But in today's lesson, we're going to start asking the user questions. This is called input. Let's start today by looking at a code example. We've got a short little program here. You'll notice it starts off with something new. Scanner scan equals new scanner of system.in. But down here at the bottom, we see some pieces that are familiar. We have a system.out.println that's outputting what is your name. And then the very last line is saying hello, an N, and then nice to meet you. So let's start by running it and seeing what happens. If I go ahead and compile, and we don't have any errors, so now I'm going to run. And notice here in the output screen, it says, what is your name? So I'm going to type in Mrs. Dovey. And when I hit enter, it says, hello, Mrs. Dovey, nice to meet you. I'm going to run it again. And now I'm going to type in Ada for Ada Lovelace. And it says, hello, Ada, nice to meet you. So what's happening here is we've got this line right here, n equals scan.nextLine. And that's what's actually creating the box on our screen. It's letting the user type in some information. Then you'll notice this n that we use with the scan line shows up here again in the system.out.println, and that's what's actually taking what they type in and displaying it on the screen. So here's the code we were just looking at. Notice up top we've got scanner scan equals new scanner of system.in. Basically what scanner does is it adds a new feature to our Java programs. It adds the ability to have input come in from the user. We'll talk later in the year about what some of these pieces mean. For right now, you just need to have scanner scan equals new scanner of system.in, semicolon, at the top of your main anytime we're going to be doing input. The next thing you'll notice is the line string in. For the user to type in information, we basically have to have a container in memory to hold that information. So we're telling the computer that they're going to type something in, and we're going to refer to that something by the name in. That's our variable name. String is our data type, so that tells Java how much memory to set up to hold the information. So when the user types in Ada, like we saw in our last example, there's now a container to hold that information. The next line is pretty familiar. It's just system.out.println, what is your name? This line right here, though, is where the input's actually happening. We're taking our variable n that we created up top, and then we're doing scan.nextLine. That's actually calling the nextLine method or command. And that's what creates that box on the screen that we then typed our information into. Now the final line here with the system.out.println does something a little bit different than what we've seen before. The hello and nice to meet you are going to show up on the screen exactly the way they're typed because they're between quotation marks. That's called a string literal. What we're doing here is we're combining that, and we want to glue our variable in. So I've got hello, I close my quotation marks, I use a plus sign, that's like a little bit of glue, and then what happens when it hits this n, and the n is not in quotation marks, that tells Java, okay, that must be a variable. So it knows to go to memory and find the information the user types in, and it plugs it in right in that spot. We have another plus sign that acts like glue, and then it says, nice to meet you. So that's why when we typed in Ada a minute ago, it said, hello, Ada, nice to meet you. So the first lesson focused on output, or displaying things on the monitor. Today, we're worrying about input. Input is pulling information into the computer, so we're going to ask the user a question and then let them type an answer back in. Now, for this to work, we actually have to have a spot in memory already set up so that Java can take whatever they type and dump it into that spot. That's called a variable. So a variable is a name for a place in the computer's memory that's going to hold the information that the user types in. The value can change while the program is running. That's a little bit different than your algebra class. So in algebra, if I do something like x plus 1 equals 9, once I subtract and figure out that x equals 8, for that problem, x is always going to equal 8. That's not the case here in programming. As your program runs, we can change what's stored in the box as many times as we need to. So the value really will vary. So when we name a variable, basically we're just giving a name that's easy for a human to remember. Java actually uses a series of letters and numbers that to a human aren't going to make a whole lot of sense to describe where something is in memory. So we might give it the name N, which might stand for name, or I could even do something like first name. Now, there are a couple rules about variable names. They can't have spaces. It's okay to have numbers, but they have to be not in the first spot. So for instance, test1 is okay, but one test would give an error message. Also, any command in Java cannot be a variable name. So one of the commands we've seen is print. You couldn't have a variable name called print. That would confuse Java. So the word declare is actually creating the variable in memory. One of the little quirks with Java is it has to know ahead of time what data type is going to be stored there. Now, what we mean by data type is basically we have things like words and we have numbers. And we'll talk more specifically about this in the next lesson, but there's a difference between an integer and a decimal value in terms of how much space it takes up in memory. So basically what we're telling Java, when I type in string in, a string data type actually takes up quite a bit of space in memory. So it's telling Java, set up a nice big box in memory so we can store lots of words and letters and characters in there. So let's look at a quick example. If I do string word equals howdy, basically what Java's going to have to do is it's going to store each letter, the H, the O, the W, the D, and the Y. And each one of these is actually going to go in its own little box in memory. Now, this has a memory address like we talked about. Memory addresses are done in hexadecimal. So again, you'll see lots of F's and B's and numbers. But again, we don't have to deal with that. Java does. For us, we give it the name word. So anytime I use word in my program, it'll pull up the word howdy and display that on the screen. So our program actually has a second variable in it. It's the scan variable. We'll cover this in more detail later in the semester, so don't get too worried about it. But what scanner is doing is adding an extra feature to our program that lets us input things. So the scanner class adds input to your Java programs. The nice thing with Java is there are all sorts of classes that you can use to add new behaviors to your programs. Now I'd like you to try it. Go to the template program, you're going to add a variable called snack, and you're going to ask the user what their favorite snack is. Then it should print, that sounds delicious. So if they type in spinach, it should output spinach sounds delicious.